much for sticking around to the last panel. So my name is Tracy. I was a former deputy managing editor at CoinDesk, and now I'm a contributing writer at Rolling Stone. So, excuse me. But we have two lovely panelists. I'll let you introduce yourselves and also kind of tell us a little bit about your background, the VC fund that you work for, and also for all of us that are staying around this late, drop some alpha on this panel.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Jesse. I'm the co-founder and general partner at Variant. We are an early-stage crypto fund. We are investing in an internet that makes people owners, and we do that across the full stack. Our focus is early-stage investing, so we try to be the first check-in to help founders go 0 to 1 in crypto. And quick background, I got started in crypto about a decade ago as a founder. I co-founded a startup called MediaChain, evident in the name, MediaChain. We were focused on digital assets of a different kind, not financial assets, but today we call them NFTs. It was a little early. That company was acquired by Spotify. And I got into investing by joining Andreessen Horowitz and helping them to launch their first crypto fund, and then started Variant to focus on very early stage investing. So that's my quick background and a little on Variant. And Jake, go ahead.
Awesome. I am Jake Chervinsky. I am Chief Legal Officer at Variant. My job, other than managing all of the firm's legal work, is to help our portfolio companies, our founders and their lawyers, navigate the very complex legal and regulatory landscape here in the United States and around the world. I got my start in crypto in about 2017. At the time, I was outside counsel at a law firm focused on regulatory compliance and government enforcement defense, mostly focused on the SEC and the CFTC. I then went full-time into crypto in 2019 as general counsel for Compound Labs, where I led the legal work for distributing the Compound governance token and decentralizing the Compound protocol, and then spent about 2 years as head of policy for the Blockchain Association, which is our industry's largest and most effective trade association in Washington, D.C., so trying to help figure out what good policy for crypto looks like. So that's me.
Okay, so the topic of our panel is decentralization, and just walking around the booths, you see it on all these banners as kind of like a buzzword, right? Decentralized AI, decentralized finance. So let's, I guess, first start with what is decentralization to you, if you could define it, if there are different types of it. And the second part of this question is, why is it so important for projects to be decentralized? And I guess we'll start with you, Jesse.
Sure. So, yeah, so it's a loaded term. Decentralization, right? So what is it, right? Well, I think everyone here has a good idea that, networks like Ethereum, like Bitcoin, the reason they exist is they are these distributed compute networks that run on independent machines all over the world. And these compute networks, they have really sort of important properties. They provide security guarantees and censorship resistance. And so that's the benefit of decentralization. And on top of networks like Ethereum, you can build applications. I think the term decentralization gets dragged all the way up the stack to everything that people can conceive of building on these things. And there's a reason for that. And I think the reason is, in large part, because of the regulatory environment that we find ourselves in the US here, where about 4 years ago, or 2019, Bill Hinman said ETH is not a security because it's sufficiently decentralized, and henceforth, the entire industry has tried to sort of run through this door of sufficient decentralization. But I would make the claim that that's actually not great for a huge swath of projects building in the space, particularly those building at the application layer, where progressive decentralization is probably more optimal.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. I guess to add a bit on the regulatory side, when I think about decentralization, what I think it means from a legal perspective is the absence of any one central party who has outsized influence in an ecosystem or a protocol or some other blockchain-based product or service, such that it makes sense to regulate them because of whatever risk they create in that ecosystem. So when we talk about sufficient decentralization, really what we mean is having an ecosystem or some other type of protocol where there is no party like that where regulation is justified. And that really was, as Jesse said, what Bill Hinman said when he initially used the term sufficient decentralization. He said, when you look at Ether today, there is no central party who should be forced to make disclosures or otherwise comply with the securities laws, because there is no one party that has privileged access to information or some other role in the Ethereum ecosystem. So we've taken that same concept and tried to apply it to a lot of other different types of protocols and products. I think what we'll get to next, though, is this isn't a perfect way to solve the regulatory challenge that we face. It's also not the only way to solve that regulatory challenge, and I think we've over-indexed on sufficient decentralization as the only way to navigate that issue when we don't need to do that.
Got it, okay. So what are some other ways to kind of satisfy the regulatory considerations that don't necessarily pertain to decentralization? It does seem like we've kind of taken it too far a bit.
Well, so I'm going to posit a wishful thinking answer, and then I'm going to let Jake posit the actual answer, or some potential actual answers. So, okay, the wishful thinking answer, I like to draw an analogy to to policy that emerged in the early aughts at the advent of social media. So as platforms like YouTube, Facebook, Instagram came online, there was a whole swath of problems related to copyright law. As you can imagine, like user-generated content kind of blew open the problem of copyrighted material propagating the internet at lightning speed. And what happened in response to that was regulation was passed, the DMCA regulation, which is imperfect, but it kind of came up with a protocol, an adaptation of the copyright laws for this new reality of user-generated content on the internet. Mm-hmm. And this protocol, the DMCA compliance protocol, is basically like copyright light. It's a way for platforms to deal with copyrighted material on their platform without like getting sued to oblivion. And similarly, I think what I would love to see happen is an adaptation of the securities laws for this new reality that we find ourselves in today, where we have user-generated assets. So user-generated content, DMCA, we need a DMCA equivalent for user-generated assets. What specifically might that look like? Well, I think if you comply with some standards, like your application runs on a smart contract platform that's public and the code's open source, there's no information asymmetry, which is the primary thing that the securities laws are trying to get at. And so you can comply with this kind of securities law light framework and basically not have to file an S1. Yeah. But this kind of protocol would allow teams that are contributing to these projects to stay involved as opposed to stepping back, like we've seen many projects in the space have to do in order to sort of fit this mold of being sufficiently decentralized, as Jake was describing. So that's my like wishful thinking, idea.
Yeah.
But
I couldn't agree more from a policy perspective. I also sadly agree that it's wishful, because that's not what the law is today. And we heard Commissioner Peirce about an hour ago talk about this. And I think the sort of sad thing is this would require a change in the law, either through Congress, like the DMCA, which was legislation passed through Congress, or rulemaking, like the token safe harbor that Commissioner Peirce herself proposed, which really addresses exactly what Jesse was saying, right? There is some risk. The risk is an information asymmetry between the creator of a token and the holder of the token. We will then require the creator of the token to make reasonable disclosures in order to address that risk. That makes perfect sense. Unfortunately, the current view of the SEC is not to allow that to happen. And it's a political decision as much as it is a legal or policy decision. So I guess to get back to the question, and maybe to drop a little bit of alpha, as you said at the end of the day here, let me maybe give you sort of a theoretical framework, conceptual framework for how to think about addressing regulatory risk, either with decentralization or without it. Whenever you think about a regulatory challenge, you have to make a decision between two different options. Option one is comply with the regulation, right? Look at the law and figure out, what does it require you to do? Is it a registration requirement? Is it a licensing requirement? Is it some other type of due diligence requirement? And then see if you can satisfy that requirement directly under the law. The second way of doing this is to structure the product or the protocol or the service in a way so that the regulation doesn't apply at all. So you don't have any compliance obligations to begin with. So every product has to sort of pick one of these two different options. And when we talk about something like a registration regime under the securities laws, unfortunately, it just does not work for the distribution of a token because tokens cannot be securities and also trade in a decentralized, permissionless environment. So instead, what we have to do for token distribution is figure out, how do we make sure that tokens are not securities, right? This is the issue we all talk about way too much. When you think about that, sufficient decentralization, as we've been discussing, is one way to make sure that the securities laws do not apply by negating, right, knocking out one of the 4 prongs of the Howey test. Well, it's not the only prong that you can knock out. And the other way that folks tend to distribute tokens is through airdrops. And airdrops do not depend on decentralization at all. An airdrop has nothing to do with sufficient decentralization. An airdrop attacks a different prong of the Howey test, the requirement of an investment of money. And this makes sense because from a policy perspective, again, the reason the securities laws apply is to protect investors. If you have no investors, then there's no reason for the securities laws to apply. So this is just one example of many where you can look at what the legal or regulatory requirement is and then figure out how to make sure that you do not create the risk that justifies regulation in the first place. And you can do that all across various regulatory frameworks that we deal with every day.
We'll eventually also talk about best practices, but just to kind of continue with their point about kind of the 2 paths, and one path could just be having the securities laws not even be applied to you. And so I do think if you've been in crypto for a while, you've seen a lot of industry practices that maybe a newcomer would scratch their head and think, why are things like this? And I'm going to name off a few. Most protocols sometimes are run by a DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization. Sometime in the past 2 years, I remember people stopped giving themselves titles and they would just call themselves contributors or core contributors. Entities would have kind of be this, the governance, the structure of the organization would have like a labs or foundation component. It was all very confusing because sometimes the names would not even be related. And so it seems like all of these practices kind of were to decentralize the entity, or what maybe some more cynical people would call decentralization theater. And so maybe you guys can talk about kind of, did any of this actually get towards the goal that they were trying reach the goal that they were trying to kind of achieve, and kind of what have we learned from kind of these experiments and these structures?
So I'll take a quick stab. So earlier I was saying, decentralization at the base layer is a requirement. It's the whole value proposition of networks like Ethereum, but we've dragged that all the way up to every application building on top, many of which have launched DAOs, many of which now have a for-profit company and a non-profit foundation. And this, I would say this is problematic for a number of reasons. The primary reason being that for many of these projects, especially building at the application layer, if you're a startup, you're looking to capture lightning in a bottle, find product market fit. Only thereafter do you really want to sort of turn over control of the product to the community, because once you do that, you slow down your rate of progress quite a bit, because you have to start making decisions by committee. And the founders have to step back and start calling themselves contributors as opposed to founders, and just basically be less involved. And when you have lightning in a bottle, or you're trying to catch it, the last thing you want to do is slow down. So this is why it's sort of, I would say, kind of problematic. And the solutions that we've sort of seen in the space are, let's take DAOs as an example, right? DAOs are meant to be decentralized, but in practice, many DAOs, the way they function is through some kind of hierarchical decision-making process. delegation is the most popular one, right? Where there are delegates in the ecosystem. It's not quite a corporate entity, but there's still kind of a hierarchy to decision making because that's really the best way we've figured out how to scale human decision making over many millenniums of trying different things. And so I think it's important to just draw a contrast. There are networks and sort of protocols in crypto that are fully automated where no human decision making is required. Like Ethereum at the base layer, there's rough consensus among the devs at this conference on the direction of Ethereum, but the protocol itself does not have any humans in the loop. There's protocols up the stack like Uniswap where there's no humans in the loop. And then there's protocols that require dynamic kind of parameterization where there need to be humans in the loop making decisions. And for those types of projects, I think decentralization can also often slow things down quite a bit at the wrong time. So I would say that that's on the back to your question, what's worked and what hasn't worked. I'd say DAO governance in large part I think is suboptimal for the vast majority of projects that jump into it too soon, and we want to find a way to kind of push that out and let the sort of founders and core people in these projects contribute for longer.
I totally agree with that, and I think that is, in a way, a good description of the term that Tracy used, which is decentralization theater. And I think it's important to talk about that just a little bit, because I think what a lot of people do is they ignore the way that I, again, think about decentralization, which is the absence of some central party that has some privileged role in the ecosystem. And what they want to do in the scope of decentralization theater is pretend like they are not playing that role, but then continue playing that role anyway, usually for regulatory purposes, but sometimes also for community signaling purposes or other reasons. And I think that that is a huge mistake. Just like Jesse said, both operationally, I think it causes a lot of problems at a point when it is not necessary, when as a founder you need to be building as opposed to dealing with a community of token holders who are causing headaches for a bunch of reasons. And also, like I said, it's not always necessary. So, and I think that ultimately if you have conversations with regulators, your attempt to pull off decentralization theater will actually give you more trouble in the end than just being honest about what you're doing. So I think for me, to go back to the question, what has worked? I think what has worked is being very honest about what you are doing and why. And that includes when it comes to deciding whether and when you want to decentralize. So to me, decentralization is a trade-off, right? It's not all good. I think in the industry, because we love decentralization and it is indeed at the core of what we're doing, we treat it as though it is sacred and always applicable. And that's not true. Decentralization means you will be very inefficient and very slow in exchange for being perhaps very secure or aligning incentives so that you don't have one group of people taking advantage of another group of people. This is sort of the Web 2 issue. This is why I think a lot of us are here in the first place, where we saw these large tech companies that were basically victimizing their own customers for the benefit of shareholders. And part of the idea of decentralized governance is to say, it is the people who will be affected by these decisions who will also make those decisions. It doesn't mean that it's going to be efficient. It's intentionally going to be inefficient, right? The best example of decentralized governance that we have before crypto is the United States Congress. If you've spent a minute looking at the United States Congress, you can see it is not efficient. It is very slow. It almost never gets anything done, and that is by design. So I think what works is know why you are decentralizing, embrace that trade-off, and then don't look back once you sort of make that decision to go from efficiency into inefficiency.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think we have time for one more quick question. So we might have some founders in the audience that could be potentially thinking about starting a project or launching a token. What is one piece of kind of very useful practical advice that you would give them?
So I think Jake just hit on it, but progressive decentralization as opposed to sufficient decentralization, which basically implies do it step by step at the right time, but the pursuit of sufficient decentralization may not be the only thing or the only path to align incentives with users and spur growth. And so that's my quick take.
Yeah, I agree. And with 15 seconds left, I guess all I would say is don't let regulatory uncertainty or mean words from policymakers scare you out of doing the work that you want to do or out of doing it here in the United States. There are ways that you can do that, and that's what we are working on right now to help people do the business they want to do in a safe and compliant way here in the US, and I think we can do that.
All right, thank you so much. Let's give our panelists a big round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful night. Good seeing you again.